Hello, everybody. Welcome to Wall Street Hackers, where we discuss the stock market and investing in general, the markets, of course. Then we're also going to look at quotes of the week. We're going to look at the stories of the week, Peter's picks, and our panel discussion, all happening very quickly in the next 30 minutes. So with that, we're going to bring in the hacker himself, a graduate in economics from UCLA, also received a law degree from the University of Miami, and also has a master's degree in business administration from NYU, otherwise known as New York University, spending 17 years in the streets of New York. None other the hacker himself, Peter Bennett. So let's bring him on. Peter, welcome to your show.
Near the streets. I wasn't really on the street, but I'll give you that.
That's good.
Close enough. That's the expression. Anyway, welcome everybody to Wall Street Hackers edition for 6/13/24. As watchers know, you can catch a new episode starting every Thursday or Saturday, depending on your distribution channel. So markets, as we always begin, there's an expression: the more things change, the more they stay the same, and that seems very true of the markets right now. Not to mention the Fed. But the media keeps reporting, quote, new highs. It happened again yesterday. New highs, new highs. It is technically true. But the S&P 500, as reflected by SPY, was at 537 yesterday morning. And in December 21, it was at 471. So that's a roughly 14% gain over 2.5 years, or 0.6% a year. But in 2022, inflation was 8%. It was 4% in 23, and 5.6% a year for this year so far. No, I'm sorry, 3.4% in 24. But so it averaged over those 3 years, roughly over the 2.5 years. I have mixed up on numbers today. Over the 2.5 years, inflation was 15%. So the market return over 2.5 years was 14% roughly. Your inflation was 15%. So for the average investor, you're basically going nowhere against inflation at all. And that's not terrible because you're getting some nominal return, but it's not exactly great for investors. And that, of course, includes the Magnificent Seven, which is now often called the Magnificent Three or Four. And it's very unlikely that the Magnificent Three or Four or Seven are going to perform like they did in the last 2.5 years, because it was a phenomenal run and they influenced the market so much. So it's really questionable what's going to happen in terms of outperforming the market. And I was going to say it's a lot like going to a casino. Some people win, some people lose. But it's really hard to be a big winner. And also, the casino keeps people coming in the gates. People keep playing the game. Nothing wrong with that, but it is hard to be a big winner in the market. You have to be really careful about where you're putting your money. So the big question for the market is obviously the Fed. It's always the Fed, basically. But there's so much uncertainty about what the Fed's going to do now. Wall Street Hackers has been very prescient in saying the Fed was behind the curve for about 1.5 years, when a few people were saying it. Then we were saying, since mid-23, we were saying there's probably not going to be any cuts, or maybe very small cuts in 20 through 24 because of inflation. And now we're saying, and I'm not in a separate camp from a lot of people today, but not everybody agrees, but I think at most you're going to get a 0.25% drop in Fed rates this year. And you doubt you'll get an increase, but you could get an increase theoretically too. But I don't think there's anything much happening, which is basically, the more things change, the more things stay the same. The Fed is definitely between a rock and a hard place. They are afraid if they raise rates, there's going to be a regional bank crisis. The regional banks are heavily into commercial real estate, and if you raise rates, the values of their treasuries will go down, and that'll also affect all banks, and that will not be good in terms of the banking sector. And on the other side, they can't lower rates a lot because inflation is basically still not under control or near where they want it to be. Their unemployment is still below 4%, and government spending is crazy in terms of the deficits, not even counting unfunded liabilities for Medicare and Social Security. So, and energy very well may go higher this summer. I'm not sure, but I wouldn't be surprised to see energy at least, $10 higher this summer. Some people are saying much higher, but that's another danger. So is the Fed going to be cutting soon? I doubt it. So bottom lines here, higher for longer means higher for longer. That's their strategy. And it's not a terrible strategy in terms of what they're doing. My criticism might be they're always giving future forecasts, which pump up the market. Oh, we're going to cut. We're going to cut. That's not their job really to keep the market up. But again, that's my opinion. Although it's not a bad thing to keep the market up, but their job is to fight inflation and keep employment under control. So let's say you disagree with a lot of that. Here's the actual news that came out this week on jobs. 272,000 jobs were created last month. They expected 180,000 jobs. So they were, quote, blowout payroll numbers. Now, that's not exactly the kind of environment the Fed can feel safe in terms of cutting rates. So we're skipping the quote of the week because I just didn't need it this week. And we're going to the 4 most interesting stories of the week segment. Number 1, interesting story. Border agents have allowed 72% of migrants who illegally crossed into the San Diego sector since the Biden administration a border, quote, crackdown to continue into the U.S. So out of 6,800 migrants encountered in Southern California, 4,900 individuals were released. Of course, this doesn't count the getaways, which is substantial. The National Border Patrol Council president for San Diego said, quote, it's all smoke and mirrors. Border agents in San Diego have been given specific instructions to exempt citizens of over 100 countries from being removed. Quite a crackdown. So you think the crackdown might have anything to do with an upcoming election in 4 months? We suspect that. And in any case, whatever your position on the border, I would prefer it if you want open borders to be honest about it. And that's the point. Whatever your position on any border, honesty in government should be the first rule. If you don't have honesty in government, you have nothing at all. You're on the path to dictatorship, basically. So, it's hard maybe for them to argue we want open borders, but I'd rather at least there be honesty and make the arguments. Interesting story number 2. There is now compelling evidence, although some would argue there was several years ago, that COVID leaked from the Wuhan Institute of Virology, but it finally made it into the New York Times. The New York Times finally admitted it. Now, in 2021, the Times lead COVID reporter not only dismissed the possibility the bug escaped from the Wuhan lab, but actually said claims were racist. Here's the quote. Someday we will stop talking about the lab leak theory and maybe even admit its racist roots. The Times also mocked Senator Tom Cotton, who you would think they'd have some respect for merely wondering if there was a lab leak from Wuhan, and called it a fringe theory. Mainstream media loves to do that. Fringe theory, conspiracy theory. They usually turn out to be true. An AP story bizarrely claimed, quote, there's no new scientific information backing the lab leak explanation. So a few points. As always, Wall Street Hackers believes MSNBC, CNN, and the New York Times, not to mention ABC and NBC, and a lot of the mainstream media who rely on sources like AP for their information, are close to or actually totally 100% useless and unreliable, because they just report what they want to report. They don't seem to care, about any news that doesn't agree with what they want to hear. So I'd rather get news that's a little more balanced, but it's worth looking at everything, obviously, just so you can see what is going on the other side, and I certainly do that. And by the way, Bloomberg News is very liberal in terms of their news reporting, but I listen to that all the time, for the financial. But sometimes they drive me crazy too with their spins. So bottom line here, I should maybe create Wall Street Hackers bottom line. I don't know if that's good or bad, but whether it's the origins of COVID, Trump is a Russian spy, or the president, or somebody who's running for president, should be tried and convicted in a court that is rigged over an 8-year-old non-disclosure agreement, I don't think we can fully trust the mainstream media, to say the least. Interesting story number 3. Artificial intelligence companies, at least some of them, are pushing back against California state lawmakers' demand that they install a kill switch designed to mitigate potential dangers posed by new technology. The new legislation, which was fleshed out by a new government-run agency, I have no problem with that, to prevent AI companies from allowing their products to gain a hazardous capability, such as starting a nuclear war, and to install guardrails around extremely large AI systems to avoid disasters like chemical weapons or assisting major cyber attacks. So it seems reasonable, but at least some tech companies are fighting this. A few tech companies have said they would leave, or they're threatening to leave, Silicon Valley altogether if this is passed. So it seems that at least some technology companies have no concern whatsoever over nuclear attacks, chemical weapons, or major cyber attacks. At least it looks that way to me, because they're not just looking to edit it. They're looking to say, we don't want this. But I'm sure these companies, even though they don't care about nuclear attacks, are really concerned about misinformation and replacing too many jobs, he said sarcastically. I try to be humorous. I know I'm not that funny. Anyway, interesting story number 4. I thought this was really interesting. Donald Trump proposed tax-free tips at his Las Vegas rally last Sunday. That seems like a really clever political move, especially to appeal to blue-collar and younger workers. Not to mention, it was done in Las Vegas, where there are a lot of hotel workers and restaurant workers, and Nevada's a swing state. Now, the downside is that it will create somewhat less collected from Medicare and Social Security, and these are phenomenally in deficits, but they're such exponentially large issues, it's really not going to impact any results. And there is an argument to be said that tips are really a gift and shouldn't be taxed, and that's been a long-standing debate. So I have no problem with it, but it is a very clever move. Either way, the government is going to be printing so much money, as we always say, and inflation and yield curve control are so likely because of the deficits. A few dollars here or there probably doesn't matter. So what to do? Wall Street Hackers believes if you want to beat a market that's basically not beating inflation, we believe the thing to do is, one, as always, own energy and especially selected U.S. pipelines like MPLX and EPD. We have large allocations there. Now we're really saying you should own, we have like a 5% allocation to energy producers. It's mostly in KRP, which has a 4% allocation. And KRP's done phenomenally well in the last month or two. But of course, you're subject to energy prices fluctuations, but also own U.S. and Canadian energy utilities, and also especially now Canadian oil producers, where we're doing slightly over 1% allocation because of the Trans Mountain Pipeline. And we're going to get into that in just a little while when we talk about the dividend pick of the week. Number two, this seems obvious, own dividend stocks because they've outperformed the S&P 500 in the 50 years to 2022 by double, and dividend growth stocks, which outperformed the S&P 500 by triple in the 50 years. And non-dividend payers hardly performed. So you want to own dividend stocks with whatever allocation you want in your stock portfolio. And finally, you have to be very selective in any environment, but especially this coming macro environment. You want to own solid companies which have good cash flows, whether or not even they're dividend payers, although that's what we want. But you want good cash flows, which make them defensive, and good balance sheets. Companies that can thrive in any macro environment. So, one moment. We're not doing commercials in the middle anymore, so I go right into the next segment. We're doing them at the beginning and end of the show. So, dividend pick of the week, as always, our disclaimers. Wall Street Hackers is for entertainment only. It's only our opinions. There's never a guarantee on any investments. If somebody says they are, forget it, because the only guaranteed investment is a CD or something fixed, but even that isn't a guarantee against inflation or if you sell it early. And finally, consult your financial advisor. So, as we mentioned recently, we really like Canadian oil producers as well as always energy, but it's just, especially because of the Trans Mountain Pipeline in Canada, because the Trans Mountain Pipeline is going to carry crude and refined products from Alberta to British Columbia and then out into the Pacific to Asia. Asia has probably an almost unquenchable thirst for refined products and oil in general because of pollution, especially in China and in India. So they're trying to replace dirtier coal. So they'll just take everything they can get, I imagine. And already the differentials between Canadian energy prices on oil and U.S. prices, which used to be very wide, are starting to narrow. So our pick this week is a 1/3 allocation to ZPTAF, which is called Surge, which is Surge Energy Inc. What we like about Surge Energy is, one, it has a 7% yield. It has a price to cash flow of 4.1, according to E-Trade. I assume that's reliable. And that means it has a 24% cash flow yield right now. Its debt to asset is very reasonable at 0.19 times. So you have to be aware that there's a 15% withholding tax on Canadian dividends if you're a U.S. investor, and withholding taxes are very likely no matter where you live if you're not Canadian. So I prefer to hold these in many cases in IRAs or 401ks because you might still pay the 15% tax, but at least you don't have to pay double taxation. You pay your tax when you defer it. And, hopefully these dividends keep growing anyway, and you eat away at that 15% loss. So, but actually in my case, I'm holding it now in non-qualified accounts for the growth, because I'll take that yield, which is fabulous after the 15% and any tax, but I think they could grow a lot. So I have a bit over 1% total, 1/3 in Surge. I'll be going sporadically through others, but I'll mix it up in case you don't like Canadian producers, just for the interest of the audience. So I think it really makes sense as a hedge against everything else. Plus, energy has generally outperformed every other sector in over most times. So we are actually running well ahead. I'm trying to close the show without cutting off our panel discussion. Nick can come in. We're going to begin our panel question of the week. Hey, Nick.
Okay.
So it's a little bit longer question. The question begins with, in a recent poll, 39% of young voters think other countries are better than the U.S. Let me say that now, not as good as the U.S. 39% of young voters think other countries are better than the U.S. So it's a two-part question, and we're going to handle it in each part, but I'm going to say both parts now. Part one, which I'll open up to Nick after we do the background, is how did this happen? And part two, what could it mean for the future of the United States? So background. When it comes to the U.S., I prefer to think of the history of U.S. history as 2/3 full rather than half or more empty. Yes, the United States had slavery, but so did much of the entire world, including much of history. As a matter of fact, slavery was a fact of life in the ancient world in China, India, Egypt, and Babylonia. By the way, a lot of this information I'm going to say now is totally accurate, but it won't be taught in public schools, or it won't be taught by people who have an agenda to knock down the United States. They just say, oh, the United States had slavery. What terrible people. But what about the rest of history and the rest of the world? It's not like we started it. So as I said, it was prevalent in ancient China, India, Egypt, and Babylonia. It was also prevalent in the indigenous populations of both North and South America, including the Aztecs and Mayans. There was historic slavery of Africans by Africans, and a lot of slavery of Africans by Arabs. Arabs also enslaved many Europeans. In the 17th century, Brazil had 31% of all resident slaves in the Western Hemisphere. Again, Brazil, 31% of all slaves in the Western Hemisphere, resident slaves. And over the century, Brazil imported 6 times the amount of slaves as the United States. Europe was heavily involved in slave trading and slavery, including Portugal, Spain, Britain, France, and the Netherlands. So on the positive side, getting into a positive side of the background, the U.S. has become a model for the world in creating, one, a government not run by kings or dictators, but a democracy with checks and balances in different government institutions. Although some people don't seem to care about that recently, like the separation between judicial and executive, but it is kind of important. The U.S. also greatly helped, obviously everybody knows this just about, that Europe fight the terrible Nazi scourge in World War II. The U.S. also established a constitution which gave people many, as it says, inalienable rights, including freedom of speech and religion. Again, a model for many countries in the world. And finally, the U.S. has become the world's economic powerhouse in the 20th century and the 21st century. People in the United States, many people, the masses in many ways, enjoy a lifestyle not found by many people in other countries, and especially by the masses in other countries. Is it perfect? No, but neither is any country for sure. But so now we get to the question part of that is, how is it that 39% of voters now believe that the United States isn't better than other countries, but is actually worse? And then we'll take time to talk about what this means for the future. Nick?
Well, this is obvious because of the decline of the American empire. We've seen that since after World War II, when the U.S. GDP represented 50% of the gross domestic product of the world. Now we're down to like 24%. We see that in our national debt. I was checking the debt figures. We're close to 35 trillion. The next country, the United Kingdom, is at 9 trillion. Then you go to another country, and they're also at 9 trillion, which is Japan. Then you go down to China, it's 2.4 trillion. So with a $34 trillion national debt that far exceeds the next 2 or 3 countries combined, you can tell that we're on a decline. We look at our educational system. We're not even in the top 25 in the scores that they do internationally to test whether students know math, reading, science, etc. So if you look at all the metrics, Peter, the U.S. empire is in a decline situation.
So let me jump in, because we'll get to the second part too, and we're always short on time. Even now we have 4 minutes. So disagreement is fine, good debate, but I don't think we're in relative decline based on the economics in a way. And in another way, I totally agree with you. In terms of debt, not relatively, because the other countries in the world have just as much debt. They have promised free healthcare to aging populations, and they haven't funded their retirement systems. they're just as much trouble. Everybody's in trouble on this. They're going to all be printing money. Second of all, relative decline. Well, you're right. In terms of GDP, we're not doing as well, but that's because the rest of the world has grown. Not that we've shrunk, but by many measures, we have a good lifestyle. You know, an apartment, the middle class or the lower class in the United States has bigger apartments than the middle class in Europe, bigger cars. Healthcare, admittedly, they say, oh, it's worse in the United States, but that's because 1/3 to 40% are obese. You can't take care of obese people that well in a healthcare system. Education, totally agree with you. We have a declining education system, and we're not going the right direction. That's for sure. So that's where I agree with you too. Let's get back into the second part, which is, and we can mention the first part too in the next 2.5 minutes. What does this mean for the United States? You know, for the future.
Future? Well, I mean, the future is going to be very challenging. You know, if you're a young person,
no doubt about it.
If you're a young person, the Gini coefficient in the United States is extremely low and going down. And that's the coefficient that measures upward mobility within a society. In the United States, it's like an all-time low. But basically, it means if you're born poor, you're going to die poor. If you're born rich, you're going to die rich. If you're born middle class, you're going to die middle class. And there's very little mobility.
That happens a lot in Europe, by the way.
Yeah,
it's hard to move. It becomes harder to move stratus. You're right.
But it's a new dynamic over here. So the thing is, the opportunities for young people are few and far between.
Very
and
true.
The fact is also, like even in Spain, the average life expectancy is 84. Here it's 77 or 79.
Again, the obesity factor I threw in. Let me wrap up because we have a minute and a half less. So first of all, a little bit more on how it happened. We have an education system, as Nick said, that is a disaster. We have public schools that aren't focused on the right topics, that are indoctrinating kids. It's a somewhat socialist system. Our colleges are totally socialist. Both offer lifetime tenure to many of their employees. Colleges overpay a lot of their people, so they've tenured high-paying jobs where they do research instead of educating people, you know, teaching enough, and it's all in the middle classes back. We have a media that is highly unethical and also pushes anti-American agendas for various reasons, but a lot of times political. In terms of, but I'm hopeful because I always like to view 2/3 full versus 1/3 empty. We're almost out of time. Churchill is attributed to say, if you're not a liberal when you're young, you have no heart. And if you're not a conservative when old, you have no brain. So hopefully we can turn around these institutions, and especially the education system. We need charter schools desperately to create diversity of thought and competition. It really helped in Florida, and we're out of time. So as always, as Kim always says, get healthy, get wealthy. Hope you have a good week, and we will see you next week. See you soon.
Welcome. Today we're going to look at a unique tax planning opportunity using life insurance to create huge tax deductions for 2020. So listen up to this not well-known plan called 412E3. Today I have a very special guest, Max Culiet, who's a certified financial planner and a registered investment advisor to help us with understanding 412E3 plans. Max, welcome to the show. What is a 412E3 plan?
Well, thanks, Nick. Simply put, a 412E3 plan is a pension plan that has to be funded solely with qualifying insurance, life insurance, and annuity contracts. The contributions to the plan are fully deductible for federal income tax, state income tax, so most of the time Social Security tax and Obamacare taxes as well.
Well, Max, I have a client right now. He's facing a $100,000 tax bill, $100,000 in 2020. Is there anything that you can do for him today?
Sure, Nick. The Secure Act that was passed a while back allows us to set up a plan in 2021 to deal with the tax year 2020. And in many cases, you can deduct $100,000, $200,000, $300,000, perhaps even more based on an actual calculation.
Max, did I hear you right? You said you can deduct $100,000. I thought you were limited to $19,500 in 2020. How did you get to a $100,000 deduction?
It's pretty simple, Nick. The 19,500 is a 401k limitation. Every plan has its rules. Profit sharing plans have a limitation of 57,000, but a pension plan is actuarially determined, and it can be well over 300,000 depending upon the math and the circumstances.
Well, Max, I want to learn more about this plan. How can I find out if this works for my clients?
Well, the best way is to give us a call. My number is 877-252-1692, or send me an email. We can certainly set up a go-to meeting, and then we can talk about your client, the specifics, the needs, etc., and design a plan that fits their needs and their budget.